Welcome to the Payments Trilogue, where 3 seasoned professionals discuss payments and more, for Europe and beyond.
Hello, my name is Michael Talmany and I'd like to welcome you to another episode of the Payments Trilogue. This time we welcome our guest Jens Holeczek, who works at the German cooperative organization and runs 2 enormous projects. One is the digital euro, which we've talked about a lot in this series, so probably not so much about that, but he also does the Giro API, and we'd really like to explore what that is about. So Jens, maybe you could just quickly introduce yourself and maybe also say a few sentences what Giro API is.
Yes, thank you very much also for the opportunity to be here and to be in this trialogue. So my name is, as you said, Jens Holeczek. I'm working for the German Association of Cooperative Banks, but not only for that. I'm also the project leader since 5 years for the Giro API project of the German Banking Industry Committee, what cares about an API scheme, not only for payment, also beyond payment. So we have also some financial information. Maybe we'll come some later to that. And in this position, I'm proud to be here and part of your dialogue.
Thank you very much. So Giro API, it sounds a bit like SPAA. It's sort of an API-based scheme on top of bank accounts. Can you help us differentiate that?
It's very interesting to differentiate or not to differentiate because there was a time coming from the ERPB API work where the German community started, and nearly the same time, I believe, some later also the EPC started with SPAA, and we had at the same time 2 different visions and started the work. So we are just in a situation that SPAA is going in the payments direction, very concrete on different use cases, while Giro API has a broad scope and also started at the same time. And I don't like to see them differentiated as a competitor to each other. I see just 2 initiatives with a different scope, and hopefully in the payment sphere they would come together in the future, but that's a part of evolution and not of a revolution. So I don't see the competition overall. I just see 2 situations started, and I believe we can learn from each other and then joining evolutional the payment stuff, while Giro API has a broader scope.
Okay.
Yeah, so could I actually just ask on that already? Because yes, I understand we have, and I guess you're a little bit in the lion's den here because with Gijs, the co-chair of SPAA, and I've been there from the start as well since whatever 5-6 years or so. But we'll come back to the competitive element or what in a bit later. But maybe one of the big questions there then is, so where do you see it going beyond what SPAA is doing?
Yes, SPAA is, as I see it, related to the payment stuff, the payment initiation with additional values like reservation of funds and also some additional stuff, while we also have in Giro API at first financial information for other account types like saving accounts, like loan accounts, like card accounts. They're also a part of SPAA. Cards are payment also, I know. But we are also looking, for example, on a FIDA compliance to have in future additional information on savings accounts, on loan accounts, and maybe also going beyond the direct account stuff by banks. So we are open because we have a sub-scheme approach, making us very flexible to extend the scheme, also API-based RTP parts or also other parts with different sub-schemes. And that's what the scope of Giro API is in the vision, beyond what SPAA is doing, but I see the conflict is in the feeling that people have around the world, because we started because it's the easiest one with payment. There is the most knowledge about APIs, so of course we started with payments. SPAA is payments only at the moment. I don't believe it will change also in the future. I don't know. And by that, everybody thinking there are 2 initiatives in competition. I see it more they are both on the same time. And we don't want it to stop Giro API versus SPAA because we have a broader scope, but also we are very interested in what's happening in SPAA. And I believe there are some differences in detail, but hopefully we can bring them together for the future because we can learn.
So Gijs, do you want to say a little bit?
I think I can mostly concur with what Jens said, of course. Indeed, the starting point is a bit different. To be honest, the ERPB exclusively asked the EPC to make a scheme for payments, and the Germans chose to do something its own initiative, not on request of the ERPB. And the sub-scheme approach, Ralph will know it, is in the ERPB report. This is the holistic model we drew already in the ERPB report of 2019. We envisaged a sort of umbrella scheme with sub-schemes, where we said the payments is the first sub-scheme because that is what EPC can do. We can imagine, and we hopefully will see that in future others, that was from the Euro Retail Payments Board, the remit is only payments, that others in other domains like mortgage, loans, insurance, whatever, they would take the model, the scheme with sub-scheme model, and make it broader than payments alone. Now, it's the Euro Retail Payments Board asking the European Payments Council, so you have to stick to payments. And indeed, there was a discussion about a year ago within the EPC. Should EPC also broaden the scope of SPAA more to the tune of what Giroapi is doing, more to accommodate also other financial services, and then it was decided, well, we are the Payments Council, we are not the Mortgage Council, Insurance Council, whatnot. We do not have that expertise. You need other ecosystems to, let's say, take the overall, the holistic approach and see if you can make that work in finance, in other domains, but payment. So, and I do believe, Jens, that unless we change, let's say, more fundamentally, the whole governance of EPC, EPC's focus will be on payments and perhaps a little bit payments related, but it will not build, at least I don't foresee that, an insurance sub-scheme, for instance. And I would hope, indeed, and we are discussing that because the representatives of Giroapi are also in the SPAA multi-stakeholder group, that at least at the payments part we can converge. One of the ways to do that is, of course, to use the same basic API specification models from the Berlin group. That's what's a good thing. And we will have future conversations on how to sort of further align, at least do, or avoid taking steps that would hinder further convergence for the payments part. Because again, from an EPC perspective, for now, the remit and the mandate is only and exclusively payments, and maybe a bit savings accounts, depending on PSD2 legislation locally implemented. But that is the fundamental difference. I think that Giroapi is broader than payments, and SPAA has to restrict itself to payments. But in that column, I would hope we would see more convergence.
Mm-hmm. And at the end, to add that, as long as implementations, we are both looking for Berlin Group, and as long as implementations are the same for the brokers and for the holders, as long as efficiency will be there for the market, and then at the end it's equal how many schemes it will be, as long as the functionalities are the same.
Would a very naive structure be sort of Giroapi is sort of like the feeder? It does all the payments and insurance and mortgage and everything, but it doesn't do the payment leg, or not exclusive, that the sort of payment leg would sit under Giroapi? That may not be what SPAA wants to hear, but it seems to me a sort of way how these bits could fit together, or is that not likely?
So if you ask me, it's at the end a part of the market request. And as long if you want to have, for example, with one user experience, savings accounts, loan accounts, and also some payment stuff in one flow, you need to have also on a technical level this combined, and then it would be difficult to have not the same technology under the same contract with the same consents of the same user. That make it a little bit difficult just to say you have one scheme under the other and mix it with the other stuff. Otherwise, you will need at least, let me call it a meta frame, what covers then this consents could be overgiven to the other scheme. And that's a little bit like the sub-scheme approach, but then you're coming to governance discussions, to dispute handling discussions, you are coming to so many discussions, and it's overall, and that was one of the reasons why we had been slower in the progress with Giroapi for some time. It's at the end very complex to have a multi-scheme approach, to have this compatibility between different sub-schemes, while having the option to have different governances per sub-scheme and the same common-based technology. So that's very, very complicated in creating it in such a clear way that it can work. And now we're at the place from January that we now can, let's say, show the market, show the regulation that it could work, but it had been hard work until yet, and it need to be proved now that it works. And maybe we still need some changes because no scheme is perfect from the beginning, of course.
And
How do you think the clients feel about that? Yeah.
Yeah, could I just
think
say?
also, sorry, I think also that Jens, sorry, Ralph, that I may be wrong because I'm not an expert in the other domains, but one of the advantages we in payments have that it's far more standardized than many of the other open finance. Oh, we can do payments. Oh, then we can do insurance. Oh, then, but that all supposes that the infrastructures are harmonized, that they use the same standards, etc., etc. And of course, that is not the case. It was too easy to believe that you could just replicate. But it's only insurance, but it's same messaging. It's fully standard, but it's not. Right?
You can the more you have actors like brokers and holders who are near to the payment stuff, because if you're a bank and you have payments account and you have also loan accounts and you know the payments world, then you can extend very easily. But if you are an only loan accounting bank like we have for Immobilien, we call it in Germany, so houses and whatever, and you have only this business, then you never had payments, and then it's a fully new world to have this, and that make FIDA so complicated. Why I personally believe this time frame with a short time is unserious, because there are too many actors need to understand from scratch what does it mean to have consents by the user flows, information per APIs. So for some of the actors, it's fully new. But at least banks have payment accounts, and can extend to the other kind of account types. But insurances is a full new world for everybody, I believe.
Yeah.
So I think we understand what Giroapi is. Maybe you could give us an update on where it stands. Is the rule book finished? Have you got a business model? Have you got when you're going to be rolling out, etc.?
So let me say we have from January started. The rulebook is published on the website under giroapi.com or giroapi.de for the German version. So we contract language is German, but it's also for convenience in English translation for everything, and at least the technical documents like the Berlin Group documents, who are part also of our scheme, mandatory part of the scheme, are in English, of course. We have published at 4th of April the version 101 with some minor bug fixes. So there were some things not clarified enough. There was just some words missing, leading to questions. So some minor points. And we have at the moment, I believe, within the next 2 weeks, the second date where you can join the scheme. So we have 4 dates for this year. And at the moment we have about 200 banks joined. The first step mostly from the cooperative sector, so they need to proactive say they want to join. We have some other asset holders are in the implementation phase, because you have a lot of some mandatory services from the beginning. So you can just join if you have them ready in your implementation. So others will follow, and they just missed for a few days the second date. So some more banks will follow. I don't know how many at the moment, because it's not our association's part when they will join. We have the first asset brokers wants to join. I believe the first also sent the first documents, and they are now in check if it's everything fulfilled. So maybe they will have the second date now. So we are at the starting point. We have sandboxes ready for the services, for all services of the scheme. We have a directory up and running, so where you can also look who is part of the scheme. Of course, it's not tested in practice, because first, as a broker, will see if he can get all asset holders. We tested it in theory, but the difference between theory and practice is always a little bit bigger in practice as in theory. And so we have an operator for the scheme who's doing the office stuff, let me call it like that. And we now have in the near future with commissioner advisors the next meeting where we talk about the next version 1.1, where we also believe multiple recurring payments could a good next service and want to ask for the next priorities, because it's very important for us. We want to work together with asset brokers, with clear governance structures, of course, a little bit like it's also in the Berlin Group, this advisor model. And we build the scheme for the market to join forces against out of European big techs and whatever we need to join. And that's the vision we have behind. So we are very open to also receive comments and additional requests for the next steps.
That's very impressive. Just for those listening who may not be familiar with the terms, I believe asset holders are basically banks and asset brokers are the users of the data, right?
Exactly.
Can you say a little bit about the commercial model? Because I think it's a bit different to the one in SPAA. Can you explain why it's different? And just tell us a bit about that.
The commercial model is always a little bit difficult to talk about because of the competition law. So overall, we have one part that are the scheme costs. And the scheme costs are just shared between all the participants with a fair model. It's just by members, and there are for the not in the governance participants, they are cut it off at a maximum. So if it's more costly, then the associations will take the part, and the banks from the are covered via the associations. But at the moment, we try to keep the cost as down as possible, and the maximum in member fees for the scheme, it's just cost-based. It's not with making every margin or profit. So the scheme itself is just cost-based, non-profit. That's what we do. We have a budget calculation every year, depending on the request. We will discuss with the advisors. We will have then a new amount lower than the maximum amount that it's good calculatable for the market. That's the scheme costs. On the other side, the services. For the services, there is a model, let me say, of articles which are assisted by the scheme, also for a very easy invoicing, because none of the asset brokers wants to have 600 invoices by cooperative banks and 300 for savings banks and whatever. So we have, let me say, standards also for transmitting invoice information and articles, names, and what are assisted by the schemes. And you can have bilateral contracts between holders and brokers for everything what you want, as long as you keep in this structure what is standardized. We have a lot of also articles standardized with a zero price. But if you want to have a fully different model, you can just put a price on it, like we have also a flat fee. So it's with zero in the fallback fee. But if you have a bilateral agreement saying, okay, me as a broker with this asset holder, I want to have a flat fee per month, then you can agree on that. And then it's also assisted that you have the invoicing assisted by the scheme. But you don't need to do, because it would be a burden at the beginning to have those bilateral discussions. You don't know which asset holder you will use as much or which asset broker will come with how many traffic. So we have a kind of fallback fee. So if there's no bilateral contract, then you will fall back on this fee. So you can just can look as an asset broker what is used by your consumers, by your customers, are the same the customers of the banks. Mm-hmm. And then you can go to the other side and say, okay, if I still use this additional services and don't do it in another way, like reservation of funds, you have different ways to do the service, but it's the easiest to do it together with an API. Then you can go there and can say, okay, I will only use it for this price as an example. And then, you have a bilateral contract. It's assisted by the scheme, but it's a different price as a fallback remuneration.
And you need to do the bilateral contract for competition reasons, because you can't agree on a single price for everybody. That wouldn't go down well, I think, right?
That's a big issue. So it's just a fallback remuneration. And if you join forces via an association or whatever, and you want to do these contracts together, there are no structures yet, because that's part of the associations to have the structures. Of course, that would be an additional option that you say, I want to have something like we 3 TPPs want to have bilateral contract with those 10 banks, for example, and then you pool them. That's also, it would be assisted by the scheme. So you have very flexible for bilateral contracts, and the structures assist that. That was important also from competition reasons, but it's not a requirement to start.
But Rolf and Gijs, maybe you could comment, because I
Yeah,
think in SPA you had a
one
different approach.
one fundamental difference in the fees. So it's never easy, of course, to create a scheme with a business model inside of it which satisfies both sides. Of course, that has to be in equilibrium, at least. So the SPA scheme works in general terms the same as a Gyro API. It has published, so it is fully transparent, it's open, public knowledge. It works with default fees, which is amounts to the same thing as the fallback fees. The difference being that in the SPA scheme, the default fees have been calculated with a agreed cost calculation methodology, and as far as we know, because they are published, um, uh, uh, fallback fees in the Gyro API schemes are more percentage based and not fixed. So the to the calculation basis of the default fees on the one hand and the fallback fees on the other hand, it's the same, but the structure of the default versus the fallback fees is different. One is fixed fees for SPA and percentages for Gyro API. But of course, you can agree on a fixed fee, as Jens explained.
Depends on the service to add
Yeah.
that. We have some services, we have also percentages fees because we see the costs also raises with the amounts, while other services are just fixed fees because it's equal
Sure.
how big the amount is.
There is no risk.
So
Yeah.
then you don't have a percentage
Yeah.
because the work is the same.
Okay, we spent quite some time on fees, but I think it is important because if these schemes don't have a mechanism where everybody's happy and gets some incentive out of that, the whole thing
Yeah,
doesn't
well,
work.
and if I could come in, because I think it is indeed the problem. So, well, when I first heard of Charo API or so, we were already like 4 years down the road with SPA, and I thought, oh, come on. For the first time, we actually have a European initiative first, and then we don't have to harmonize 27 countries because we're going central first, and then Germany comes up with Charo API. So I thought, oh no, but I have changed my mind in the meantime. And of course, one of the reasons is that, well, you have all the banks and maybe a couple of TVPs. We have sort of all the TVPs, but no bank. So it would be really nice to sort of match and marry or whatever here our activities. And we have done for the last year and a half, I think, or ever since we were looking at both Charo API and SPA, we have tried very hard to get things technically compatible. So to have, well, because both are really burning group based, SPA initially was agnostic to a standard, but no other standard has sort of lived up to the challenge of providing all these functionalities. So it is also, and it was only the Berlin Group standard now who has applied for being the basis for it. So we'll both work on the same standard, and we're gonna, of course, do that, or the implementation guidelines or instructions in a way that any participant, like all the banks now participating in Charo API, could do SPA without any further technical investment. Basically using the same basis and the same type of implementation for the overlapping functionality. I appreciate that there is not everything overlapping, but for where it overlaps, it would be the same thing, because that's how I was hoping that, okay, then in Germany, all the banks are there. And I guess it's also worthwhile making clear that it is a bank driven. It is the banking associations who are running the scheme. It's not like a 50-50 thing like SPA. Which also was another reason for having hesitations, of course. But I'll come back to that. But anyway, so it has led to the situation where the banks, it's their baby, and so they are also doing it, which is great. So therefore, I thought, okay, well, this could give the right momentum to SPA here by having all the German banks who are part of Charo API. They will do then SPA in addition for the international parts. But, and now the big but, I wonder if the commercial arrangement differences could now get in the way of that. you think?
a very interesting part that you raised that. So first, let me say one point that's important for me also personally. I still looking forward to SPAA and what I said earlier, that we don't see us as a competitor. We just had at the same time in some parts a different approach, but we also had it somewhere easier, because if you're coming from a country, associations with a country, you have a more harmonized market. That makes a lot of discussions much easier. Some others more difficult. Okay, but some are, at least as the technical standards, are much easier. So that is one of the reasons we all had Berlin Group in Germany. That's not all over Europe. So you have some discussions, not what you had, Ralf, you highlighted that you were API agnostic on the standards at the beginning. Now you're looking also on this. We had, for example, an appendix where we directly worked on harmonization of the Berlin Group specification in the usage, make it very easy, because we think deleting dialects is also something has an own value. But for that, you need to go very, very deep in this translation between the business rules and the Berlin Group specifications, where very flexible, but somehow optional, conditional, and whatever. And we try to fix as much as possible to be as clear as possible. But we had an easier challenge, because we are just coming from more harmonized situations. And what's at the end important is that the same implementation can be used. And the second part I want to highlight on this prices discussion, and that's something where I believe we need to join forces also about competition office, about the regulator and everybody. At the end, a scheme can always only work if we have the maximum of asset holders have an interest, because they can give some value to the market and to earn some money for the investment. And you have on the other side, as much as a brokers, they say, I see the value is worth this price. So at the end, also a scheme with this default or fallback fee is in a kind, it's damned to find the right price balance, because otherwise you will have only brokers and no holders, or otherwise have only holders and no brokers. And to have this optimal price is something of a market mechanism. And maybe the fallback fees we have in Giro API, if we see too many people try to have, or no, it's the wrong wording. If too many asset brokers say the price is too high, we need to have bilateral contracts, then maybe the fallback remuneration is too high, and we need maybe to change. That would be a big change. It would be a lot of work, because every participant needs to re-sign the contract in this case. But we have these options to find the right market price for all participants, and we are damned to do it, otherwise no scheme will fly.
That's precisely, by the way, what we did, Jens. Finding the optimal price from the brokers and the holders' perspective, that was all part of the cost calculation exercise we did for SPAA. That's why we ended up with the fees, both sides being equally unhappy or happy, if you will. The point, we don't know if it's the right fees, because we need volumes first to see if we can attract.
We the same.
Exactly the same. And at some point in time, hopefully rather sooner than later, we will have to recalibrate the fees, because we will have, if we are successful, the prices will go down, and you will have to recalibrate. Simple as that. But it's a chicken and egg thing.
The good news is we have two agreements independently of each other, and I think with that we are a bit the envy of the rest of the world. Because no one else has that. I think the UK has been trying for a while, and is continued to try finding a model there. And I'm also not aware of anywhere else in the world where open banking, like a premium open banking, or whatever you want to classify it, has managed to agree like a business model for it. And I think, but that is of course absolutely required for making premium open banking work somehow.
At the end, if for the customer it should have added value and should make life of us all some easier, we just need to have all fun with the business for our common customers. That must be the rule. And as long as one side is too unhappy, I not say everybody needs to be happy, but as long as one side is too unhappy, it will not work.
And at the moment we have this interesting situation where SPAA has lots of TPPs, but not many banks, and Giroapi has it the other way around, right? Lots of banks, but not many TPPs. So let's hope this does indeed come together in a way.
Well, if I may, Michael, one very interesting thing I think Jens said, which Ralph knows we've also been discussing recently in the SPAA multi-stakeholder group, is now that it has become more clear, and yes, there is still a Polish API, and yes, there's also still the French STET, but apart from that, there seems to be sort of consensus that the future is, the pan-European future is based on the Berlin Group specs, and what you said, that you have influenced, let's say, the functionality mapped on if I'm non-technical, on the Berlin Group specs, is one thing. We said, well, now it's clear that the Berlin Group will be the way forward. Maybe we can sort of sanitize our rulebook and make it simpler by really tuning it into the Berlin Group specs. And maybe the exercise you've been doing, if I understood it correctly, could be very helpful for us to do that exercise, to sort of clean up the rulebook from everything that we don't need if you choose only for the Berlin Group specs and not from an agnostic perspective.
I believe that's one part, what's needed in SPAA. Another part is we try to be in Giroapi with the use cases as much, no, not with the use cases, with the services, as much use case agnostic as possible.
Yeah.
So if you have, for example, reservation of funds, it's in Giroapi, it's equal if you use it for a petrol station, getting electricity, or in e-commerce, pay by delivery. So it's just the same service, because the rest could be done on the asset broker side, makes the implementation much cheaper, as if you make 3 services, just as an example. It's illustrative only, but if you make 3 different services to pay e-commerce, pay by delivery, and petrol stations with an authorization in the beginning and the concrete amount some later, and if you make 3 services, you have 3 implementations. Raising the cost could be done cheaper on the broker side. So what we tried in Giroapi, and that's maybe also part why we have a different governance and choosing for a different governance in the past, that we try to understand what the market needs, and we try to search for the cheapest way to fulfill this with the most agnostic service for cheapest implementation. And that's also part of the difference, because that's also something I see in FIDA. If you have people don't know the implementations on the banking side, they have a wish. The wish is, okay, we want to know it. But if they talk to you how you need to fulfill it, it may be much expensive as if you have the choice how to fulfill this wish. And that's something, if the governance talking about the implementation and the users are talking about the implementation on the other side, that's always garbage, because it would be the same as if I talk to the broker and say how they need to implement the user story in the interfaces. That would not work. They know their business, I know my business. They need to say that are my requirements, and the holder side need to make it as cheap as possible, that the price is okay for everybody. That's also one of the difference between governance and how the services are framed at the moment.
I'm looking at Ralph here, because I'm personally not so sure if we have such a different approach here. Indeed, SPAA started with asking the market, what is it you want? What are the use cases you want to be covered by the API services? But we are not implementing functionality. Well, we call it functionality, but they are API services. The brokers need to fulfill their use cases. We are not doing so. I think it's a bit of a semantic misunderstanding here, and not so much a fundamental different approach. But maybe I understood it wrong, Ralph.
No, I think you're right. It is. Well, I can understand where Jens is coming from, but it is indeed the case that it is also, I think at the end of the day, what counts also for SPAA or within SPAA is not a specific use case. It is functionality, so API functionality that will allow then a myriad of hopefully use cases, and it's only the broker's decision then what to do, what to make out of it, and not and not because we don't want to be that limited either. We don't want to be limited to like 5 use cases in SPAA. We out of the functionalities you will be able to make 50. And but one other thing I wanted to come back to though was the governance, because as already highlighted earlier, so this is a bank-driven, bank-owned, bank-governed scheme. It's not a 50-50 like SPAA. which made me very skeptical initially, but actually was similar for the Berlin Group governance before. Well, at the time when I sort of joined in there from a demand side perspective to the advisory board, and I think you mentioned you're following a similar arrangement there with advisory boards. So the TPPs or the brokers have an advisory role, but not. So they have an advisory board, but are not on the real board. And now that, of course, is a bit of a different thing between an advisory board and a real board. But I should say that with hindsight now, I don't know, a few years, 3, 4 already with Berlin Group governance, I can confirm that when we are not talking compliance, when we are talking premium services, when we are talking about some commercial arrangement, when we are trying to find win-wins, then all the trouble that we had in the past with open banking back and forth, and where especially Kais and I spent years in battling fiercely, is really dogfights. None of that has happened really in SPAA, and I guess also not in Giroapi, because there is so much common ground and will for cooperation and finding a win-win that this is really so much better than just trying to create competitive services based on sticks, on compliance only, on forcing banks into something that they don't like.
So at the end, it's always the same equal governance structure. So our interest also from the banking side is to have something what is used. And it would be a very bad choice not to listen on what the market needs.
That's fair. I think our time is gradually coming to an end, but one question I do have to ask Jens and the others: why Germany? Why did this competing scheme or this extra scheme come along in Germany? If it had come out of the Nordics or the Netherlands or Hungary, I would have been surprised. But why was it the Germans?
Yeah, it's maybe the same situation, like why the Berlin Group and not named Paris Group or whatever, Madrid Group, or where it could have been the first meeting in the past. I believe maybe it's because Germany had, with the GBIC, always a body who was talking about standardization also in the past. If you look 30 years ago, like a credit transfer is done between banks, there had been agreements. So in a kind of multilateral schemes, Germany always had a lot of experience. I don't know if before PSD2, other countries had something like FinTS or HBCE specifications and standards. So we always were working on multilateral standardization agreements. And if you look also for this Girocard schemes, we also had with business schemes some experience in the past. And I believe it's just a reason that from our history, we have some experience, and still the same people on board can bring their knowledge into the creation of this new scheme. Maybe that's one of the reasons. I don't have another reason for it as this.
No, I mean, that's one in the eye for people who don't believe Germany is innovative. I mean, they have shown that they were one of the first on PSD2, and they're the first on this new thing, despite it being an incredibly complex, multi-dimensional market. So that's a huge achievement you've done there, Jens.
Michael, we don't talk about digitization overall in Germany. Then I would fully assist what you are saying. So there are something of the backlights, I believe, sometimes. But for the banking sphere, for the API scheme, I think we are not in front, we are just on the same speed like SPAA, and hopefully we come evolutional more and more together, because at the end it doesn't make sense. Payment always had been scale, and we also need here one implementation, maximum usage, and but we are open for that, but we don't want to restrict ourselves to bring the vision to the front. So let's start evolutional, not revolutional. That would be the better way at the moment, I believe.
Can we have one more wish? Just get rid of the Funklöcher.
I have a lot of wishes on that, but
okay, let's not delve too much into the use of packet devices in German government. Otherwise, we will spend a bit more time here. But I think, Jens, you've been incredibly lucid. Thank you very much for explaining this topic, which is indeed complex, and Ralph and Gijs for spending the time with us together. You three young people in your open neck shirts, and me fuddy-duddy with my jacket and old school tie. I think we can sign off, and thank you all for watching, and thank you all here for this podcast.
Thank you.
Thank you for your invitation.
Thank you.
Many thanks for watching and listening. We hope you enjoyed this episode. Looking forward to seeing you again next time.